In this lesson, I'm going to give you an overview of SSMS, or SQL Server Management Studio, and the ins and outs of how it works. So you've already seen SQL Server Management Studio once, but let me show you again. Here's a login screen. Remember, we connect to one or more databases using this login box. The first time you open up SSMS, it's going to ask us for this because typically we want to be connected to a database before we do anything. So I'll connect to Dot, which is my local machine or local host. I'll use Windows Server Authentication instead of my SQL Server Authentication. I'll hit connect. I'll wait for it, and we'll connect to my SQL Server instance on this box, the default instance. And now I have all my options for this SQL Server. Now, I said one or more connections because you can have multiple connections over here in the Object Explorer. So I could say connect to Database Engine or any of these others, but let's just say Database Engine, and then connect to a different one. I could put the IP address or the network path or even just the instance name here and connect to that as well, and it would open up as a separate root node like this with all the same information below it. Okay, so we only have one to connect to, so we'll leave it like it is. Now let's look at some other things in here. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and change the default options for the font size. Both get run. So these are actually two separate SQL statements. Select one, select two. But because the query window acts the way it does, I can highlight just the code I want to run, just the T-SQL. Now the other thing I just did was I didn't want to see the results window. That results window is this window down here. But now that I perform the action, I say, you know what, I don't want to see that anymore. So in order to hide that, I just hit Control R. And that hid that window until the next time I want to run something, in which case it pops back up. This query window, like I said, is probably the place you'll spend the most time. So let's look at some other options with this query window. First of all, on the upper left-hand corner right here, there's a drop-down. And it says Available Databases, and Master is the one selected. And I have four options here: Master, Model, MSDB, and TempDB. This selection here tells me which database by default I'm using for this query window. So if you are running a query and you're not sure why it's not working, the best thing to do is to make sure that this window says your database name. Next, I have been executing these statements by using the execute button. That runs that. But you can also execute this by hitting the F5 key. Notice that runs it as well. If you want to comment something out, you can use the dash dash, and that turns it green, showing you that it is commented out. Or you can use a slash star, and then anywhere else the star slash. Now the difference here, let me just put another one in here. The difference here between these two types of comments is that the dash dash is only for that line, whereas the slash star says comment everything below me until I get to a star slash. So currently I have commented out both the select 1 and select 2 statements. So if I hit execute, just 3 is returned. But notice that the highlighting still works. So I've highlighted just the select 2, even though it's inside of those comments. If I hit execute, it does run. And the reason why is because when I highlight, that overrides any comments if I don't also highlight those comments. So for example, if I highlight like this, it would only do execute the 3 because these comments get ignored. But since I'm highlighting inside the comment and the comment items are not a part of this highlight, that will execute. The way I use this typically is if I'm doing some type of statement that is destructive or changes things. For example, if I'm deleting records, what I'll do is I'll first make sure I know which records I'm deleting by doing a select statement. And we'll get into those in a future lesson. But then I'll put my delete statement inside of these comments so I don't accidentally hit F5 and execute both the delete and the select. That way I have to intentionally come inside the comments, highlight the delete statement, and hit execute. So just a little tip there that we'll use more in the future. But those are the two types of comments we'll be using. And that pretty much covers the query window for now. The only other thing I want to point out is the fact that you can save these. You can also have more than one open at a time. All right, so I'll close that out. I will not save it. Notice by default, kind of went too fast in that one. Let me do this again. If I were to save this, the default extension is .sql. And that's a SQL script extension. And it really is just a text file, so you can open it up in Notepad or your favorite text editor. But .sql files are the common extension for any type of SQL script. Okay, on the left over here, the place we'll spend most of our time is inside this databases folder. So let's just take a peek at the other folders just so we see what they are. We're not going to deal with server objects, replication, polybase, always on high availability, management, or integration services. We're just not going to touch on those. That's a pretty deep subject, more for if you wanted to be a full-on database administrator. But if you're just getting into building databases, my encouragement to you, as I said before, is just get your feet wet building databases, using databases, and manipulating databases. The more comfort level you have with databases, the better off you're going to be when you get into the more dense topics of full administration. So what does that leave? Well, we have security here, which we'll look at briefly. And again, we're going to ignore most of this stuff, but let's open up logins just to point out a couple of things. First of all, down here at the bottom, we have SA and we have SQL demo /tquery. This is my Windows login, and this is the system administrator local SQL login. And if I were to go to properties on this, I could see what security rights it has at the server level. Let's wait for that to come up. There we go. So I can change the password. I can enforce a password policy and expiration. And then here under server roles, I can see that it's both a public role and also the sysadmin role, which means pretty much it has access to the entire system. And those are feeling like groups. Okay, so user mapping. So for each of the 4 databases we have currently, we have DB_owner access for each of them. What that means basically is you're the owner of a database, meaning you have full rights to everything when it comes to that database. We could change that if you wanted to, but for a SA account or system administrator account, typically we don't. If you're going to get into being a database administrator full-time or a full-fledged database administrator, you'd want to come in here and make some modifications. First of all, maybe even lock down or close the SA account. And the reason why is because everyone knows the SA is a system administrator. So you want to change it to a different account just for some obfuscation, if nothing else. But then also you want to be more targeted in who you give what permissions to. This is a very large blanket permission. Basically, you have access to everything. Not always a great thing when it comes to a system administrator. So usually we want to break those apart into different roles. So one sysadmin has access to these tasks, and another sysadmin has access to those tasks. You might have one overarching sysadmin, or if you're a small shop, sure, you have one guy that does it all. But that's just at least something to address if you're talking about a full database administrator. When it comes to SQL Server developers, where you're just doing development work, this is great, having the SA role, because it allows you to do everything you need to do without really stepping on your own toes. All right, and finally, status. You could disable this login or deny permission to connect to the database engine. So this is where you come in and change that if you wanted to lock out the SA, if you've already given those permissions to one or more other people. So that's logins. So there's the SA and the SQL demo /T query. Those were created at installation. But they also have these right here. So from this one all the way down to this one. These are accounts that SQL Server creates for different tasks. So we leave those alone unless we know for sure we want to change them. But for our purposes, we're not going to change them. Under roles, here's the different roles you have by default: bulk admin, DB creator, disk admin, and all the rest. Again, for developers, we probably won't touch these. The one thing that I usually do in a production or soon-to-be production database is I'll add a role for just executing stored procedures. And we'll cover what stored procedures are and why you'd want that role. But what that would do is it would lock you down to only doing certain tasks in the database and really secure your database pretty tightly. So back up under databases. By default, when you install SQL Server, you get 4 databases. And they are under the System Databases folder. Now, until you are super familiar and know exactly what you're doing and why, here's my advice. Don't touch them. Just don't. Not a good thing. Think of this kind of like the System32 folder inside of Windows. That folder that has DLLs and other things you're not sure what they are, but you know if you delete them that bad things happen. Well, that's what these are. Each of these has a role in your database. For example, tempdb is a place where swap data goes, and it pulls some database data in there before it goes into your real, quote-unquote, real database. So there's a purpose behind each of these, but the key here is just don't touch them, okay? So when we create a database, we'll create one in this folder, and it will go outside of the system databases folder. It'll be down here. And that brings up the next thing, which is how do we create a database? Well, it's really simple. The right-click menu is really powerful inside SQL Server. When in doubt, right-click. So I right-click on Databases, and I get New Database. And we'll do that in the next lesson, but that's how you create a database. We also have these other actions here. Restore database, restore files and groups, and all the rest. So restore database is if you have a backup file from somewhere. You would find that file either from another database or from a device, which is actually a file usually. So backup media is file. You have URL too if you wanted to back up from a website, but unless your database is really small, good luck with that. So you just click the add and go browse on your machine, find it, and go through the steps. And we'll do that later on in this course, but I just want to point out to you that this right click is really powerful. If I'm on master, if I right click under tasks, I can say backup. And it will allow me to back up and walk through different options for that. And again, we'll cover backups in a future lesson. So that's an overview of SQL Server Management Studio. When you first come in, you have to log in using this dialog right here. You connect to the SQL Server instance and location where you want to. For our purposes, we're going to always connect to the dot, which is the default instance on this machine. And we'll always use the Windows authentication. We could use the SA login name using the SQL Server authentication and the password that we set up. Once we're in here, typically we'll live in this new query window, but we also have over here on the left a lot of information that we need, and we can right click on anywhere and get access to a whole bunch of options based upon where we right clicked, even in our window over here on the right. So that's an overview of SSMS, or SQL Server Management Studio. We'll be using this tool extensively from now on, so make sure that you practice opening it and logging in, making sure you know where everything is. All right, don't get too stressed out about it. You'll see it over and over again. So if you're not quite sure you caught something, either go back and watch the video again, or just wait, we'll do it again in an upcoming video.